Hello students, welcome to MOOC Political Economy 2. The topic for today's discussion is economic management in an age of globalization. The first question with which we will start the discussion is the concept of globalization. What exactly do we mean by globalization? There is an interesting book by Deepak Nair and Amit Bhaduri called The Intelligent Person's Guide to Liberalization, in which the authors say that liberalization, privatization, globalization are all euphemistic expressions leading to the high noon of capitalism. It is a celebration of worldwide capitalism. Now, capitalism, Lenin had pointed out, had originated in the Western industrialized countries, and very soon the domestic market was saturated, yet production was going up. So, in the search for new markets, these Western imperialist countries stretched out to different parts of the world and colonized different parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America and converted them into colonies. And that is the basic story of imperialism in the earlier times. This, of course, got transformed in the post-Second World War period into a new phenomenon called neocolonialism or neo-imperialism, in which we find that the domination by the West continues over different countries across the world, but through subtle and surreptitious techniques. This advance of capitalism is what we see in today's world as globalization. It is basically an intensification of worldwide interconnectedness. It is defined as a historical process involving a fundamental shift or transformation in the spatial scale of human social organization that links distant communities and expands the reach of power relations across regions and continents of the world. It is an intensification of worldwide interconnectedness involving four different elements to which I would like to draw your attention. First, it is a stretching of social, political, and economic activities across frontiers, regions, and continents. Second, it is marked by the intensification of a growing volume of interconnectedness and flows of trade, investment, finance, migration, and culture. Third, it can be linked up to a speeding of global interactions and processes with the increase in the development of worldwide systems of transport and communication. And fourth, the growing extensity, intensity, and velocity of global interactions, as a result of which the boundaries between domestic matters and global affairs become increasingly fluid. Now, what have been the effects of this globalization? You see, I just drew your attention to the fact that it is a celebration of worldwide capitalism. But like capitalism in earlier times, even now, you must understand that it does not unfold in a level playing field. And scholars have made repeated attempts to draw attention to the seamy side of globalization, and they have drawn attention to the disparaging effects of globalization in the case of peripheral economies in the third world, where entrenched poverty, backwardness, squalor, and other handicaps inhibit major segments of the population from taking advantage or deriving mileage out of the opportunities that globalization has to offer. In fact, as Magru points out, the radically uneven distribution of power in today's world makes for a distorted global politics in which the interests of the few more often than not take precedence over the interests of the majority of humankind. The basic thrust of globalization is economic, because as I just said, it is a celebration of worldwide capitalism. The notion of globalization, with its concomitant emphasis on economic liberalization, deregulation, and free trade, has been linked up with a certain degree of erosion of state sovereignty, since nation states, particularly in the third world, have been impelled to tailor their domestic policies vis-à-vis foreign trade and direct investment to the rules of the game enunciated by the big players, the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF, who constitute the institutional apparatus of economic globalization. And what we see in today's world is the existence of various regimes operating at various levels: environment, human rights, economic governance. So global governance today seems to be the order of the day. This thrust of globalization, which has required nation states to play second fiddle to the tune that is enunciated by the bandmasters of economic liberalization, the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF. They have definitely eroded the sovereignty of the nation states. The discretion of the nation states to be the ultimate arbiter of policy vis-a-vis the population over whom they rule has been to an extent diluted. In India, for instance, initially after independence, we saw a clearly interventionist state, and in the initial days of independence, we are familiar with the license Raj that prevailed in India. But post-1990, with the inauguration of the age of economic reforms, India has marched into the age of liberalization. And during this time, we see that gradually the state is abandoning all kinds of controls and giving more space to private players. Increasingly non-interventionist role of the state embraced by the nation states, particularly in the third world, in relation to the economic sphere is noticeable. Many apprehend that this has led to an eclipse of the nation state. On closer scrutiny, however, it is found that the state, far from approaching any kind of atrophy in an age of globalization, has in fact on many occasions assumed strength and has actually been an initiator and even facilitator of the globalization process. Through a deliberate withdrawal of control in respect of certain domains, it has actually crafted out for itself a nuanced role. What is this nuanced role that the state displays in an age of globalization? Such a role requires the state to tailor its economy and polity so as to be able to sail on the high tide of globalization, while at the same time emerging as a supportive institution for addressing various kinds of social inadequacies and handicaps which have transpired because the opportunities that have been unleashed by globalization cannot be used by all segments of the population to an equal extent. In fact, one has to be conscious of the inequalities that have been spawned with the onset of globalization. The nuanced role on part of the state also embodies a newly emerging relationship between the civil society and the state. Therefore, we can definitely say that the state has not really shrunk in an age of globalization. While it has withdrawn from certain sectors where it has allowed a free hand to players to carry on with the task of economic production, distribution, and exchange, in certain other areas, it has had to step in the interest of those sections of the population which have clearly emerged as the losers in the process of globalization. And this is what requires the state to act as a manager of globalization. I will draw your attention to this aspect even later, but there is an interesting book by Jagdish Bhagwati called In Defense of Globalization, in which he says, in this particular book, where he argues in favor of globalization, that the state has emerged as some kind of a manager of globalization. It has to manage globalization in the sense that it has to tailor the rules enunciated at the global level to suit the interests of the country concerned, and also think of necessary action, some affirmative steps on its part in the interest of those sections of the population who have fallen behind in the race. It is commonplace to look at globalization as having inaugurated a borderless world, a concept floated for the first time by Kenichi Omiya. Globalization refers to the tendency of traditional political borders based on nation and state boundaries to become permeable. It also implies that divisions between people previously separated by time and space have become less significant and are sometimes entirely irrelevant because of the seamless movement of people and commodities across national borders. Scholte therefore argued that globalization is linked to the growth of supra-territorial relations between people because of an increasing range of connections which have a trans-border character. Huge flows of electronic money now surge around the world at the flick of a computer switch, ensuring that currency and other financial markets react almost immediately to economic events anywhere in the world. Similarly, cable and satellite technology allow telephone messages and TV programs to be transmitted across the world almost instantaneously. But how is this globalization different from contemporary globalization? You see, Globalization quintessentially can be traced even back to the time of Alexander, when he was trying to stretch the frontiers of the Macedonian Empire to other parts of the world. But in today's world, globalization has assumed a different form because of certain important developments. Bhagwati comments that there are fundamental differences between the globalization that we are witnessing today and the kind that was set in motion earlier, which gives contemporary globalization a special and at times a sharp edge. The earlier integration of the economy at the world level was driven more by technological changes in transport and communication rather than by policy changes. By contrast, today's most dramatic changes, the degree to which governments have intervened to reduce obstacles to the flow of trade and investments worldwide. The story of globalization today must therefore be written in two inks, one colored by technical change and the other by state action as corroborated by its policy interventions, both in respect of accommodating globalization to particular situations and also in regard to the kind of affirmative action that the state has come up with in the interest of those sections who have not been able to cope with the market vicissitudes of globalization. By no means, therefore, does globalization imply that the local and the national are subordinate to the global. Rather, it highlights the deepening as well as the broadening of the political process in the sense that local, national, and global events are interacting with each other almost continuously. As Magru clarifies, globalization is transforming but not burying the Westphalian ideal of sovereign statehood. It is producing the disaggregated state. We live in a state-centric world even today, but definitely the role of the state is undergoing some kind of a metamorphosis. Certainly not an eclipse. And the globalization that is happening around the world, and that has been happening for quite some time, can be understood as something that is unfolding through several waves. In the first wave, which is referred to as the Age of Discovery, spanning 1450 to 1850, globalization was decisively shaped by European expansion and conquest. In the second wave, spanning 1850 through 1945, the world evidenced a major expansion in the spread and entrenchment of European empires. By comparison, contemporary globalization, which is beyond 1960, marks a new epoch. In human affairs, we see that just as in the Industrial Revolution, the expansion of the West in the 19th century defined a new age in world history, today it is the microchip and the satellite which are the icons of a new globalized order. But this globalization, although many would like to talk about globalization in terms of phenomena like McDonaldization or Americanization, or basically the ascendancy of the American Western type culture across the world or cultural imperialism, despite all that, we definitely agree that the interconnected that globalization has spawned is multidimensional. The popular image of globalization is that it is a top-down approach, and that is why we keep referring to McDonaldization and cultural imperialism on part of the US. But the establishment of a single global system that imprints itself on all parts of the world is perhaps not the right view. In fact, in this view, globalization is linked to homogenization as cultural, social, economic, and political diversities are destroyed across the world, in which we all seem to be watching the same television programs, buying the same commodities, fascinated by the same kinds of fast food, whether it's McDonald's or KFC, and we seem to follow the antics of the same celebrities. But it is important to bear in mind that globalization does go hand in hand with localization, regionalization, and multiculturalization. In fact, it is commonplace today to talk in terms of multiculturalism. The question is, what is economic globalization? Economic globalization today is reflected in the idea that no national economy is really an island. All economies have, to a lesser or greater extent, come to be a part of a process of interlocking global economy. Globalization has therefore been defined as a shift from a world of distinct national economy to a global economy in which production, internationalization, and financial capital flows freely and instantly between countries. One of the key implications of economic globalization is the reduced capacity of national governments to manage their economies and, in particular, to resist their restricting along free market lines. Multinational corporations organize marketing and production on a global scale, while the operation of global financial markets determines which countries get credit and which countries get credit upon what terms. The main issue, therefore, about globalization is nothing but capitalism, something which we have clarified at the very outset, that globalization is nothing but the celebration of worldwide capitalism. The interconnectedness that lies at the heart of globalization is invariably linked to the extension of market exchange and commercial practices. Globalization has a pronounced neoliberal or free market ideological character. And as I said again and again, capitalism is the core issue. Supporters of globalization, sometimes called globalists, they usually argue that capitalism tends towards specific prosperity and widening opportunity, in which case global capitalism with inequality and exploitation will simply generate new forms of misery and injustice. And that is because I've already clarified that globalization unfolds in a playing field that is far from level. Because the opportunities ushered in by globalization cannot be utilized by all cross sections to an equal extent, obviously there are losers and there are gainers. In one important aspect, however, the globalization debate is new, and that is it is conducted within a post-socialist framework that no longer recognizes that there are viable alternatives to the market structure and capitalist organization. So what is the basic debate that is happening today between the positive and the pessimistic globalists, given that with the downfall of the erstwhile Soviet Union, socialism as a global ideology has got considerably discredited? The positive globalists would like to draw attention to the potential of stretched social relations to improve the quality of life, raise living standards, and bring people together, which in turn promotes the sharing of cultures and understanding among nations and peoples around the world. The pessimistic globalists, on the other hand, see the world as becoming less diverse and more homogeneous. They harp on the dominance of major economic and political interests, particularly in the countries of the North like the US, Western Europe, and Japan, who are able effectively to resist all pressures for change and can impose their own agenda on the rest of the world, which is why globalization, according to them, is almost synonymous with Americanization. They see the diminution of national identities and sovereignty negatively and point to the uneven consequences of globalization. They also focus on specific groups such as women and unskilled manual laborers as major victims of globalization. In fact, although globalization has its disadvantages, but it would be argued by most that those poor nations who have embarked upon globalization tend to become less poor. Although in a system which embraces world capitalism, there is an inherent tendency of the rich nations to get richer and the poorer nations to get poorer, the globalists argue that the poor nations get less poor. Referring to the increasing amount of trade taking place in a globalizing world in the form of transfer of goods at various stages of production, Kelly and Prokofnik observe, and this is an interesting observation, as part of this development, several fast-growing, newly industrializing countries such as South Korea and China are now major exporters of intermediate and finished manufacturing products to the so-called developed countries. Such countries were the source of 22% of all manufactured goods imported by the USA in the late 1990s, up from about 10% in the early 1970s. Why would the liberal pluralists welcome the emergence of a global economy, which is the major facet of globalization? From the perspective of the liberal pluralists, the emergence of a global economy is to be welcomed because free trade allows each country to specialize in the production of those goods and services that it is best suited to produce. This leads to internationalization and specialization and mutual benefits. For instance, the transfer of production from developed to developing states benefit the former because production costs less and therefore prices are kept low, but also benefits the latter because wage levels tend to rise, and this stimulates the domestic economy and fosters enterprise. In this view, the only parts of the world that fail to benefit from globalization are those that choose to remain outside it. So the state has to basically emerge as a manager of globalization. I remember doing an interesting study on the handloom weavers of Pulia, who were allowed to indulge in contracts on their own with markets across the world ever since the dawning of the liberalization age in India. But progressively, the situation of these handloom weavers in West Bengal were declining because not every weaver was able to take advantage of the opportunities of globalization. They are not, for instance, computer savvy. So therefore, their literacy inhibits them from reaching out to global markets. They also do not have adequate social safety nets. If their products are rejected at the last moment, they have nothing to fall back upon. They do not have adequate medical facilities. There are drainage problems in the localities they inhabit because most of these handlooms operate below the ground level, and therefore during the rainy season, because of waterlogging, often their contraptions are submerged in water and they are inoperative, rendering them workless. So because all these categories need to be bailed out from the situational poverty which wraps them up, it is important that the state emerges as a manager of globalization, which is being drawn attention to by Jagdish Bhagwat in his book In Defense of Globalization. The need to conjure up a notion that globalization will naturally usher in all the concomitant benefits to any country that wishes to open its doors to it is perhaps not really the correct view. Therefore, Bhagwati cautions that globalization must be managed so that its fundamentally benign effects are ensured and reinforced. Without this wise management, it is imperiled. That is why the state is a manager of globalization. This management will be better and more effective if governments, international institutions, corporations, and intellectuals who celebrate and reinforce globalization joined hands with the non-governmental organizations and actors that generally discount and oppose it, create some kind of a partnership in achieving what is called shared success or shared prosperity. So what are the advantages of globalization? The obvious advantages include, first, opening up to international trade, which has helped many countries to grow at a much faster rate than would have been otherwise possible. International trade aids economic development when a country's export drive its economic growth. In fact, export-led growth was the centerpiece of the industrial policy that enriched much of Asia and improved the plight of millions of people in that continent. Globalization has also reduced the sense of isolation felt in much of the developing world and has given many people in the developing countries access to knowledge well beyond the reach of even the wealthiest sections in any country a century ago. But what is important is to keep in mind that globalization does bring about progress, but it is not necessarily progress. Despite its professed advantages and benefits, it would be a fallacy to consider that globalization is equivalent to progress. In fact, to many in the developing world, there has been a widening gulf between the promise and the performance of globalization, and that is why I drew your attention to the specific case of the Pulia weavers in West Bengal in the recent past. Stiglitz draws attention to this seamy side of globalization in the following words. A growing divide between the haves and the have-nots has left increasing numbers in the third world in dire poverty, living on less than $1 a day. The Western countries have pushed poor countries to eliminate trade barriers but kept up their own barriers. preventing developing countries from exporting their agricultural products and so depriving them of desperately needed export income. The point which I would like to make is this, that globalization can of course bring about growth, but the haunting question and the daunting question is, this is not necessarily inclusive growth. There are a lot of people who may well be left out from the cake or a share of the cake that globalization promises. Globalization does and can certainly bring about growth, but this does not necessarily mean inclusive growth. The beneficial aspects of globalization may not percolate to all strata of society. Under no circumstance, therefore, is the role of the state curtailed or precluded even in an age of economic globalization where much is left to the market. Poverty incidence in India, for instance, has been falling at a trend of about 1 percentage point per year since the 1970s. And the country now appears to have turned to this trend, and this decline, therefore, is definitely not a welcome feature in the contemporary scenario. So what else needs to be done by governments in an age of globalization? Widening regional disparities and limited growth in lagging areas has made the overall growth process less pro-poor over time. Therefore, it is important to turn to differences in access to infrastructure and social services like healthcare and education that make it harder for poor people to take up the opportunities afforded by aggregate economic growth. Such heterogeneity in the impact of growth on poverty holds important clues as to what else needs to be done by governments over and above or beyond promoting economic growth in order to ensure poverty alleviation. Therefore, those who are saying that growth is not enough are not typically saying that growth does not reduce absolute income poverty, which as an empirical generalization is of course impossible to deny. They are saying that combining growth-promoting economic reforms with the right policies to help assure that poor can participate fully in the opportunities unleashed by growth will achieve more rapid poverty reduction than would be possible otherwise. And that is why in an age of economic globalization, although the market seems to have taken over many of the responsibilities that were hitherto carried out by the state, in all fairness, it is clear to all of us that the state has come up with a nuanced role where it has to step in as a manager of globalization, both in accommodating globalization to its situational reality and also in extending affirmative supportive action in favor of those sections of the population who are unable to take advantage of the opportunities offered by globalization.